Napoleon Bonaparte, remembered primarily as a military conqueror who reshaped Europe's borders through decades of warfare, was also a revolutionary administrative reformer who created legal and financial institutions that outlasted his military conquests and continue to shape European life 2 centuries after his defeat. And among his most consequential but least recognized reforms were his banking and commercial laws, the creation of the Banque de France in 1800, the Commercial Code of 1807, the regulations governing bills of exchange and bankruptcy and corporate structure, and the systematic codification of property rights and contract law, all of which created a framework for modern commerce and finance that spread across Europe through French conquest, was adopted by conquered territories, and persisted after Napoleon's defeat because these institutions were useful, served needs that neither the ancien regime's chaotic systems nor purely laissez-faire alternatives could satisfy. And this institutional legacy is paradoxical. Because Napoleon himself was authoritarian, his laws were imposed by military force, his banking system was designed primarily to finance his wars and to maintain state control over finance. Yet the institutions he created turned out to be more durable and more beneficial than the political systems he imposed. His legal codes survived while his empire collapsed. His banking structures persisted while his military conquests were reversed. And today's European financial architecture, from central banking to commercial law to bankruptcy procedures, still operates largely within frameworks that Napoleon established or systematized, making him an unlikely founder of modern capitalism. And understanding how this happened, how military conquest inadvertently spread institutional innovations that enabled commercial development, how authoritarian legal frameworks designed for control became foundations for economic freedom, and how Napoleon's financial pragmatism shaped structures that would facilitate European integration centuries later. This reveals fundamental truths about how institutions spread and persist, about the relationship between state power and economic development, and about how the infrastructure of capitalism was built not just by merchants and capitalists, but also by state builders who were trying to achieve entirely different goals, but who created frameworks that commerce would later exploit. Napoleon inherited a French financial system that was chaotic and unstable. The revolution had destroyed the ancien regime's fiscal apparatus, had abolished the hated tax farming system where private contractors collected taxes and kept a share, had repudiated royal debts, had issued assignats, paper currency backed by confiscated church lands, which had collapsed into hyperinflation by 1796, rendering savings worthless and destroying confidence in government finance, and the Directory that ruled France from 1795 to 1799 had been unable to establish fiscal order, couldn't collect taxes efficiently, couldn't borrow because nobody trusted government debt, couldn't pay the army or civil servants regularly, and this fiscal chaos threatened the revolution's survival. Armies that weren't paid mutinied, administrators who weren't paid were corrupt, and the economy suffered from monetary instability and lack of credit. So when Napoleon seized power in 1799's coup d'état, establishing himself as first consul, one of his first priorities was creating fiscal stability, establishing institutions that could collect taxes, manage debt, provide stable currency, and finance the state. And his solution was the Banque de France, created in 1800 as a private institution, but with special privileges and government oversight, modeled partly on the Bank of England, but with more state control. And this was radical, creating a central bank to manage currency and credit, to serve as banker to the government, and to coordinate the financial system. And the Banque de France succeeded where revolutionary institutions had failed, stabilized the currency, restored confidence in government debt, and provided the financial foundation for Napoleon's military campaigns and administrative reforms. The Banque de France's structure revealed Napoleon's approach to institutions. It was technically private, owned by shareholders who expected profits, but it operated under government charter, had monopoly on note issue in Paris, was governed partly by state appointees, and was expected to serve state interests, financing government operations, managing public debt, regulating other banks. And this public-private hybrid became the template for European central banking, combining private capital and management with public oversight and public purposes. And it worked because it aligned private incentives with state needs. Shareholders profited from the monopoly privileges while the state gained a reliable source of credit and a mechanism for monetary control. And this model spread across Europe as French armies conquered territory. Belgium and the Netherlands and parts of Germany and Italy all got institutions modeled on the Banque de France. And even after French rule ended, these institutions often persisted because they served useful functions. Local elites and governments found that central banks provided stability and credit that purely private systems didn't. So Napoleon's imposed institutions became voluntary institutions, maintained not because France required it, but because they worked, in variations of this model. Central banks with monopoly note issue and special relationship to government became standard across Europe and eventually worldwide, making the Banque de France the prototype for modern central banking. And while the Bank of England predated it and influenced its design, the Banque de France's systematic integration of monetary control, debt management, and financial regulation became the model that most countries copied. The Commercial Code of 1807 was even more influential. It systematized commercial law, codified rules for partnerships and corporations, regulated bills of exchange and promissory notes, established bankruptcy procedures, and created legal framework for commerce that was far more rational and comprehensive than the hodgepodge of medieval customs and royal ordinances that had previously governed French commerce. And like the Napoleonic legal codes that reformed civil law and criminal law, the Commercial Code was designed to be universal, to apply the same rules everywhere in French territory regardless of local traditions. And this uniformity was revolutionary. It made commerce more predictable, reduced transaction costs, enabled businesses to operate across regions without navigating different legal systems, and it spread beyond French borders through conquest. French-occupied territories adopted the Commercial Code, often because local merchants and businesses found it superior to their previous systems, clearer, more rational, more favorable to commercial activity. And after French occupation ended, many territories kept the Commercial Code or kept large portions of it. Because it worked, because businesses had adapted to it, because reverting to previous systems would be disruptive. So Napoleon's conquest inadvertently harmonized commercial law across large parts of Europe, created common legal frameworks that facilitated trade and investment across borders, and laid groundwork for eventual European economic integration, because businesses operating under similar legal frameworks could more easily conduct cross-border transactions, could understand and predict each other's obligations and rights. And this legal harmonization was foundation for the common market that would emerge a century later. The bankruptcy laws that Napoleon established were particularly consequential. Pre-Napoleonic bankruptcy in most of Europe was essentially debtor's prison. Defaulting on debts meant imprisonment, meant social disgrace, meant permanent inability to engage in commerce. And this made commerce extremely risky, meant that a single bad venture could destroy a merchant's life, and this risk discouraged entrepreneurship, made people conservative, reluctant to take the risks that commerce requires. But Napoleon's bankruptcy laws, while not lenient by modern standards, established procedures for orderly liquidation, distinguished between fraudulent bankruptcy, which was severely punished, and honest bankruptcy, which could be resolved through asset liquidation and discharge of remaining debts. And crucially, they made bankruptcy a legal process rather than a criminal one in most cases. This allowed merchants who failed to eventually return to business to start again without permanent stigma, and this encouraged risk-taking, encouraged entrepreneurship, made commerce more dynamic, and the concept that bankruptcy is a process to be managed rather than a crime to be punished. This spread through Europe with the Napoleonic Code, became standard in commercial law, and enabled the entrepreneurial dynamism that characterized 19th century European capitalism. Because entrepreneurs could take risks knowing that failure wouldn't mean permanent ruin, that they could fail, discharge debts, and try again. And this legal framework for managing failure was as important as the frameworks for managing success in enabling capitalist development. The property rights codification that Napoleon achieved through the Civil Code was fundamental to commercial development. The code established clear rules about ownership, about transfer of property, about inheritance, about contracts, and this clarity was essential for capitalism. You can't have markets without clear property rights, without confidence that what you buy is actually yours, that contracts will be enforced, that the state won't arbitrarily seize your property, and pre-Napoleonic. France had confused property rights, remnants of feudalism, local variations in customs, ecclesiastical claims, privileges, and exemptions, making ownership uncertain and transactions complex. But the Napoleonic Code swept away this complexity, established uniform clear rules, abolished feudal remnants, made property transferable and inheritable according to rational principles. And this enabled markets to function, enabled land and capital to be bought and sold, enabled credit because lenders could take property as collateral knowing that their claims would be enforced. And again, this spread through conquest. Conquered territories adopted or were forced to adopt the Napoleonic Code, and many kept it after French rule ended, because clear property rights benefited economic development, benefited both elites who owned property and ordinary people who could now buy and sell and inherit according to predictable rules. So Napoleon's legal rationalization, designed primarily to consolidate state power and to eliminate feudal privileges that challenged state authority, inadvertently created the legal infrastructure for capitalist development. The corporate law frameworks that emerged from Napoleonic commercial regulation established principles that persist today: the distinction between partnerships and corporations, the concept of limited liability for corporate shareholders, the requirements for corporate governance and disclosure, the regulations on stock issuance and transfer. All of these were systematized in Napoleon's commercial code or in subsequent regulations influenced by it. And these frameworks spread across Europe, became standard in commercial law, and enabled the corporate form to emerge as dominant organizational structure for large-scale enterprise. Because limited liability made it possible to raise capital from many investors without exposing them to unlimited risk, and corporate law provided frameworks for governing these complex organizations, for resolving disputes among shareholders, for protecting creditors, and for ensuring some minimum level of disclosure and accountability. And while corporate law has evolved enormously since Napoleon, the basic structures, the distinction between owners and managers, the concept of the corporation as legal person, the balance between shareholder rights and creditor protections, these all trace to Napoleonic innovations or systematizations, making Napoleon an unlikely architect of modern corporate capitalism. Because he was trying to create state control over commerce, trying to prevent business from threatening state power, but the institutional frameworks he created turned out to enable business to flourish in ways he probably didn't intend or foresee. The gold standard that emerged in the 19th century was partly enabled by Napoleon's monetary reforms. The Banque de France under Napoleon established stable metallic backing for currency, maintained convertibility between notes and specie, and this created confidence in paper currency, demonstrated that properly managed central banks could maintain monetary stability. And after the chaos of the assignats and the revolutionary currency experiments, this stability was revolutionary. It proved that paper money could work if properly managed, if backed by metal reserves, if issued by credible institutions, and this model influenced the development of the international gold standard, where currencies were backed by gold and convertible into gold at fixed rates. And while the gold standard eventually proved too rigid, as we've discussed, it did provide monetary stability for several decades in the 19th century, facilitated international trade, and the credibility that made it work was partly established by institutions like the Banque de France that demonstrated that central banks could maintain convertibility, could resist the temptation to inflate, could serve as anchors for monetary systems. So Napoleon's monetary conservatism, his insistence on metal backing and controlled note issue, influenced the development of the international monetary system that would dominate the 19th century. The spread of Napoleonic institutions across Europe occurred through multiple mechanisms: direct imposition during French occupation, voluntary adoption by countries that saw benefits, influence through professional networks of lawyers and administrators who studied French systems and adapted them elsewhere, and competitive pressure where countries adopted French-style institutions to keep pace with neighbors who had. And this spread created convergence, made European commercial and financial systems more similar, reduced the fragmentation that had characterized pre-Napoleonic Europe, and this convergence facilitated economic integration, made cross-border trade and investment easier, created conditions for the eventual emergence of European Union, because countries operating under similar legal and financial frameworks could more easily coordinate, could more easily create common markets and monetary unions. So Napoleon's institutional legacy was the hidden foundation for European integration, provided the common frameworks that made integration possible. And it's ironic that an emperor who conquered Europe to unite it under French hegemony, who failed militarily and politically to create lasting empire, succeeded inadvertently in creating institutional foundations for eventual voluntary European integration, achieved through law and finance what he couldn't achieve through war. The resistance to Napoleon's institutions was limited because they served interests of important groups. Merchants and businesses benefited from clearer laws and better financial infrastructure. Governments benefited from more effective tax collection and debt management. Lawyers and administrators benefited from systematic codes that enhanced their professional status. So even in countries that hated French occupation, that fought to expel French armies, the institutions often persisted, because enough influential people wanted them to persist. And this reveals something important about how institutions spread and endure. They survive when they serve the interests of powerful groups, when they solve problems that people actually face, when the benefits of maintaining them exceed the costs of transition to alternatives. And Napoleon's financial and commercial institutions met these criteria. They solved real problems: unclear property rights, chaotic bankruptcy, monetary instability, fragmented commercial law, and the solutions they provided were valuable enough that people kept them even when they could have rejected them. And this suggests that institutional innovations, regardless of how they're initially imposed, can become self-sustaining if they're useful, if they align with interests and needs, and that the method of imposition matters less than the quality of the institution in determining its long-term persistence. The modern European Central Bank and the Eurozone's institutional architecture have Napoleonic DNA. The ECB is modeled on the Bundesbank, which was itself influenced by the Banque de France. The emphasis on price stability, the independence from direct political control, the monopoly on currency issue, the role in managing government debt. These all echo Napoleonic central banking. And the euro itself, a single currency for multiple political entities, is arguably what Napoleon tried to create. Through conquest, monetary unification of Europe. And while the euro was created voluntarily and democratically, while Napoleon's system was imposed by force, the underlying logic is similar, that monetary unification facilitates commerce, reduces transaction costs, creates economic benefits that can overcome political fragmentation. And the euro's success and struggles both reflect this Napoleonic legacy. Success in creating monetary stability and facilitating trade, struggles with the tension between unified monetary policy and fragmented fiscal policy, between central control and national sovereignty, tensions that Napoleon resolved through authoritarianism, but that democratic Europe must resolve through negotiation and compromise. And whether the euro succeeds long-term will partly depend on whether it can balance these tensions better than Napoleon did, can maintain benefits of monetary unification without the political costs of centralized control. The limitations of Napoleon's institutional legacy are that many of his reforms, while advanced for their time, are now outdated. The commercial code has been updated repeatedly, incorporates new forms of business organization, new technologies, new understanding of market regulation. The Banque de France has been subsumed into the European Central Bank system, operates under very different frameworks than Napoleon created. Bankruptcy law has evolved to be more debtor-friendly, to facilitate restructuring rather than just liquidation, to recognize that preserving going concerns is often better than liquidating them. So while the basic structures persist, the specific content has changed enormously, and this is appropriate. Institutions must evolve to remain relevant, must adapt to changing economic and social conditions. And the real legacy isn't the specific laws Napoleon wrote, but the approach to institution building. The idea that rational, systematic legal codes serve commerce better than customary law, that central banking can provide monetary stability, that bankruptcy should be orderly process rather than debtor's prison, that property rights need codification, that commercial law benefits from uniformity. These insights remain valid even as specific implementations change, making Napoleon's legacy methodological as much as substantive, a demonstration of how state building and legal rationalization can create foundations for economic development, even when that's not the primary goal. The counterfactual where Napoleon never existed or where his reforms were reversed after his defeat suggests that European economic development would have been slower and more fragmented. Without systematic commercial codes and central banking and rationalized property rights, European capitalism would have faced higher transaction costs, more uncertainty, more barriers to cross-border activity, and this would have slowed growth, would have made European economies less competitive with Britain, and later with America, would have delayed industrialization and financial development, and eventually Europeans would have created these institutions anyway, through gradual evolution or through copying British models. But Napoleon's forced rapid systematization accelerated the process, spread institutions quickly across the continent, and created convergence that took centuries to achieve naturally. So Napoleon's institutional legacy was partly about acceleration, about compressing institutional development that would have happened eventually into a few decades of forced reform. And while this forced imposition had costs, created resistance and resentment, the long-term benefits of having systematic commercial and financial frameworks decades earlier than organic development would have provided. These benefits arguably exceeded the costs, made European capitalism more dynamic and European integration more feasible than would otherwise have been possible. The irony is that Napoleon, fundamentally a military autocrat who used financial institutions primarily to fund wars and control society, created frameworks that enabled liberal capitalism and democratic governance. The institutions he built to consolidate state power became foundations for limiting state power. The commercial laws designed to control business became frameworks protecting business from arbitrary state action. The central bank created to finance military campaigns became institution protecting monetary stability from political manipulation, and the property rights codified to strengthen state authority became guarantees against state expropriation. So Napoleon's authoritarian institutions became liberal institutions, not because he intended this transformation, but because institutions have their own logic, create their own path dependencies, serve purposes beyond their creators' intentions, and commerce and capitalism exploited the frameworks Napoleon created, used them to develop in ways Napoleon wouldn't have approved. And this is perhaps the ultimate irony, that the emperor who tried to control everything inadvertently created systems that escaped his control, that persisted beyond his empire, that served purposes he didn't intend, and that ultimately proved more important than his military conquests, making Napoleon's banking laws, not his battles, his most enduring legacy, the foundation of modern European finance and commerce, created by a dictator for dictatorial purposes, but transformed through time and use into infrastructure for democratic capitalism, still shaping Europe 2 centuries after Napoleon's death, still governing how Europeans conduct commerce and manage money and organize businesses, a testament to how institutions outlive their creators, how forced reforms can become voluntary practices, how conquest's unintended consequences can be more important than its intended ones, and how the infrastructure of capitalism was built not just by merchants and bankers acting freely, but also by emperors and conquerors imposing systems for their own purposes, systems that would later be adapted and transformed and used in ways their creators never imagined, making institutional history a story of unintended consequences, of adaptations and transformations, of structures designed for one purpose being used for another, and of how Napoleon Bonaparte, military genius and political autocrat, became unlikely architect of modern European financial institutions through reforms designed to fund his wars, but which outlasted his empire to shape the peaceful commercial integration of the continent he failed to unite through conquest.